Okay, we're going to do something a little bit different today. I don't know how it's going to work out. We'll find out. On the screen is the name of this book right here. The Story of the Pilgrims. And this is written in 1927 by what's her name? Is it on there? Ella Powers. Yeah. She was born in 1865. And it's actually put on your birthday, Jason. Except a few years earlier. January 1.
I'm looking good for my age.
Yeah, you are very good. 2020. It's written for school children, public school children, and a little story about the Pilgrims. So what we're going to do, rather than trying to memorize all this stuff, we're going to read the book. But we're going to read 4 different sections. Jason's going to read the first section, and then Caleb's going to read the second section, and Rachel's going to read the third section, and I'll read the fourth section. So hopefully we do a good job. It's simply written, and hopefully you can follow along, because I know sometimes it's hard to follow somebody when they're reading rather than just speaking. Sometimes it makes it more difficult. But I believe we'll do good, because it's simply written. No big words.
And we're simple people.
And we're simple people, absolutely. So, Jason, we'll let you start with page number 1. All right.
So this is the story of the Pilgrims, and it says the Pilgrims in England and Holland. Long, long ago, some good people lived in the little town of Scrooby in England. They wished to worship God in their own way. They wished for freedom to do what they thought was right. These people were called pilgrims. Many of the English people did not treat these pilgrims kindly. They called them by harsh names. Even the king persecuted them. He said they must go to his church. He said all who would not go to his church must be put in prison. This made the pilgrims very unhappy, and they said, "We cannot live here." And so they decided to move to some other country. In 1607, they felt their pretty homes. In 1607, they left their pretty homes and went to the country of Holland. They lived in the city of Leyden. But what a strange country Holland seemed to be to those boys and girls. The children laughed to see the rows and rows of great flapping windmills which pump the water and grind the grain for the people in that land. How strange it seemed to live on land that was below the level of the sea, too. The high walls that kept the ocean from overflowing the land were a source of wonder to the children. Sometimes the children would go with their papas to see the Dutch people who lived on canal boats. Some of the Dutch eat, sleep, work, and even have their gardens on canal boats. Along the Dutch people treated the English kindly. The people from England did not just like the strange country. They said, "We want the schools and churches that are better than these." The English said, "If we stay here many years longer, our little boys and girls will be speaking Dutch. And we shall all have their manners, ideas, and feelings." Then some of the brave men said, "Let us go across the ocean to the new land called America. Let us live in a country that shall be our own." Others said, "Oh, think of the long journey. What perils and dangers there will be in sailing so far. Do you think our children and our wives are strong enough to take such a long, rough trip?" Others said, "Even if we all live to reach that land, who is there to greet us in America? There will be no one to welcome us, no friends, no food, no white people. We shall be ruined and famine, diseased, and death will come to us." But William Bradford and many others said, God will take care of us. We will go." How brave and full of courage they were. "But think of the Indians," said one of the boys. They may try to kill us and burn our homes." Then William Brewster said, "God will surely take care of all his children. All things that are great are difficult to do. So let us be brave and trust that all will be well." Then they began to make their plans for their long and wonderful journey across the wide ocean. Several of the men sold their property in Leyden. With this money, they helped to build a ship called Speedwell. And oh, what a rickety old ship it proved to be. The little ship Speedwell was brought and fitted up in Holland, and another called the Mayflower was hired in London. So in July of 1620, this little band of pilgrims who had lived in Holland for 17 years went to Delft Haven. Here was the ship Speedwell ready to receive them. After many prayers, they said goodbye to their friends. How fast their hearts beat as the sails were hoisted. With tearful eyes but brave hearts, the little company sailed forth upon the water. Soon they reached Southampton, where they found the other ship called the Mayflower, with the rest of the company who were to sail with them in that ship to America. On August 5th, 1620, the two ships set sail for the unknown country. Never was there a more courageous little company. Never in the world did two ships carry braver hearts. The ships had sailed not more than 100 miles when one of the sailors on the Speedwell cried out, "Our ship is leaking! Our ship is leaking! We must go back! We must go back! Our ship will sink!" So back to the coast of England the two ships sailed, and the ship's Speedwell was repaired. Then again they turned their prows toward the west. But the two ships sailed not more than 300 miles when another leak and a greater one appeared in the Speedwell. One of the men said in despair, "We cannot cross the ocean in this poor ship. We must not think of it. It is not strong enough. Sea is leaking badly." The men saw that they must take back the Speedwell, so they sailed back to England. The little ship Mayflower was not large enough to carry all, so 20 of the people were left behind. 100 of the brave and determined ones were now aboard the Mayflower. And once again, on the 6th day of September, 1620, the sails were hoisted, and the little one solitary vessel sailed away. Little Mary Ellerton and some of the other children would sometime come up to the deck of the ship and watch the great waves catch sight of the fish or watch the swift flying clouds. After a little time, they grew very tired of being shut up in the cabin of the ships. They longed to be on land and see the trees, birds, and flowers. Then the days began to grow cold. The stormy weather came. The sky was dark, and the little ship was tossed up and down to the huge waves. The angry sea washed over the deck, and the cabins were flooded with water. Suddenly, in the furious blast, the main beam of the ship broke. But one of the men had brought an iron screw from Holland, and the beam was mended. The faces of the women and the children grew white with fear, for they felt that the little ship was surely being engulfed. The frightened sailors cried, "We are lost! The ship is not built strong enough for such a heavy storm as this. We shall sink." In little groups the sailors gathered, and they said, "We will go back to England. Let us turn the ship back. Let us go home. We can never sail through such a storm as this." But the brave, strong men did not lose hope. They tossed the sailors that they were already more than halfway to America, and that God would surely take them in safety across the sea. When the storm became more furious, they were obliged to take down sails and to anchor for several days. They were crowded almost to suffocation in the little cabin. Right, Caleb? And Mary Ellerton, Dad, was Steve French's
My
grandma, many generations. So that's pretty cool. That is pretty neat to have a family member on the Mayflower. Okay, Caleb, you're next. All right. The children huddled together and listened with frightened faces to the shrieking blasts as they howled through the rigging of the ship. One day during the storm, John Howland was thrown from the deck of the ship into the sea. He caught hold of the topsail halyards which hung overboard. Some of the men threw out a boat hook and some ropes, and he was saved. Another day, one cruel sailor said, as he saw the people who were seasick, heartsick and weary, "I hope half your numbers will fall overboard before this journey is over." This was a very cruel speech, but the wicked sailor was punished. He himself in a few days died, and he was thrown into the sea. One day, when Mary Allerton and Mary Chilton were looking far out over the waters, someone said, "Oh, what do you think is down in that cabin? You cannot think there is a little baby down there." Away went the girls, and sure enough, there was a little child, a dear little boy, baby, that had come to them. Mistress Hopkins was its mamma, and how everyone petted and fondled that baby. They were a long time trying to find a name for that wonderful baby. But after several names were suggested, they said, "This means ocean." They said, "We will call this boy baby Oceanus." This means ocean, and it is just the name for him. We shall always remember that he was born on the ocean. This was not the only baby that was born on the ship. Oh no, for just before the Pilgrims landed, another baby came to them. This baby was named Peregrine. What a funny name that was for a little boy. But there were a great many funny names in those old days. Peregrine means wanderer. Now there were two little babies to love and care for, little Oceanus Hopkins and little Peregrine White. Everyone on that little ship had a kind word and a loving arm for those two babies. One cold day in November, after many long weary weeks of sailing, a voice was heard crying out, "Land, land." How swiftly and eagerly everyone on board that little vessel rushed up on deck to get once more a sight of land. How thankful everyone was to see the land, after being so shut up and huddled together for so many long weeks. How good it seemed to think of being somewhere else than in that dark, cold, and crowded cabin. With full hearts, they thanked God. "This is not Virginia," said Mary Allerton's papa. "We were to reach the coast of Virginia, but here is ice and snow, and is bitter cold on this northern coast." "Yes," said William Brewster, "we are much farther north than Virginia," and the good man looked far out over the waters of the harbor, in which great cakes of ice were floating. It was Cape Cod Bay, where the little ship had come on the cold morning in November of 1620. Some of the children came up on the deck of the little ship, but the winds were so keen and sharp that they were glad to go below into the cabin. Many others were too weary and worn and sick to even walk up the deck and see the new land to which they had come. Light-hearted Mary Chilton said gaily, "Well, even if this is not Virginia, methinks it will be a fine thing to step on foot again on solid land." "Bravely said," replied William Bradford. "We will soon have comfortable homes along the shore in some suitable place. Let us make our homes here, where God has led us," said Love Brewster's papa. How the strong waves dashed up, and how the spray from the water beat against them. But these brave-hearted people had been on the rough sea so long that they did not mind the cold. Some of the boys came up on the deck, and they saw the great forest trees waving to and fro along the shore. They saw the snow piled up on the ground. They saw that the sky was cold and gray, and the shore was bleak and barren. Almost all the pilgrims were cold and hungry. Day by day, their little stocks of food had grown less and less. They dared not to eat as much as they wished, because they feared a day night come when there would be nothing to eat. At first, the pilgrims decided to live upon the ship until the men should land and find a suitable place for homes. Parties of men took a boat and skirted along the shore to find a landing place. How dreary and bare everything looked. Not a house, not a person, only the great forest in front of them and the great ocean behind them. And yet there were some people in that deep, dark forest. They were savage tribes of Indians. Captain Standish and some of the other men were well armed and ready for any Indians who might attack them. What stormy days those were to the little party of men who had gone to explore the coast. The cold winds, the sleet, the rain were so severe that the water froze on their clothing, making them heavy and stiff. Their little boat was tossed about on the water, and 2 or 3 times they thought it would sink. One day they lost the rudder. At another time the mast was carried away, and in the darkness of the night they drifted to an island. One day as they were exploring the shore, they came to a place where some Indians had lived for a time. They found an old burial place, some deserted wigwams, and some parched acorns. One morning, just after they had finished eating their breakfast on the beach, they suddenly heard a great yell and looked up and saw that some Indians were upon them. A flight of arrows fell among them, and they saw that 30 or 40 Indians were ready to fight with them. Brave Miles Standish, their captain, was ever ready to guard himself and his men, and he at once fired upon the brain of savages. The Indians were very much afraid of the gunpowder which the white men used, and ran away as fast as they could. Miles Standish picked up some of those arrows which the Indians had fired at them, and found them headed with brass and horn. While a few of the men were away, trying to find a good landing place, the mothers were busy. In fact, these pilgrim mothers were always busy. The mothers said, "While the ship is at anchor here, and while some of the men are away, let us have a washing day." They had seen that there was a little pond of fresh water not far from the shore, and here was just the place to have a fine washing. "Yes, oh yes," said the mothers. "It is quite time that we have a good wash day." So all the clothes that needed to be washed and all the tubs were brought forth. The men helped to fill the tubs and rowed the party to the shore. That was a fine wash day, to be sure. The men built fires after they had chopped down wood. Then they filled the great kettles with water and hung them on long poles over the fires. Soon the water was streaming hot, and the women, like to many gypsies, were washing away as if they had never known anything better. With sleeves rolled up, they scrubbed and scrubbed until all the clothes were white and clean. Out on the shore, they hung the clothes, which were soon dried and sweet and clean, with the sun and fresh air. "How good it does seem to have this proper washing day," said Priscilla Mullins. "And what a fine thing it is to run about on land once more," added Mary Chilton. After a time, the men came back and said they had found a good place for a landing. This was at the place called Plymouth, on December 21, 1620. The 100 brave pilgrims rowed from their ship to the land. Mary Chilton and John Alden were the first of the young people to spring out upon Plymouth Rock. How glad they were to be once again on land. The two babies and many others lived upon the ship until the men had time to build homes for them. Among all the little pilgrim children, there were 8 little girls, and such strange names as they all had. What should we think if in these days, we should meet a little girl named Remember, or meet another child called Resolved?
All right. Such a dreary Christmas as that was to the little pilgrim boys and girls in 1620. There were no presents, no merrymaking, no comforts, no cheer. Their papas were too busy talking about where the little settlement should be to think very much about Christmas. They said, "We must first build a house large enough for many of us to live in, and a little later every man shall build a home for himself and his family." So these brave, earnest, hard-working men began at once to chop down the trees and make a large, rough-shed fort. This was very hard work. In those days, there were the forest trees, to be sure, but no sawmills to make the trees into boards. There were shells, sand, and clay for mortar, but no brick kilns where the clay is burned into bricks. There was granite, but no way of using it. No sawmills, no brick kilns, no granite workers, but these pilgrims had something better than all these with them. They had strong, ready, and willing hands to wield the broad axe and cut the great trees, and manfully each one went to work. Even the boys were eager and glad to work where they could. They helped to strip the bark from the trees. This bark was used for the roofs of the houses. The boys, too, could bring wood for the fires that had to be built along the shore, that the men might not freeze during those bitter cold days. Even though the fires were kept burning on the coast, these men were daily out in the cold, chopping down the trees in the forest. Often they were nearly frozen, and many grew sick. Others worked on diligently, although they were almost too weak to stand, and so the days passed on. Each day they learned of more in their little band who were too ill to work, too ill to sit up, too ill to speak. There were no delicate little foods to nourish the sick ones, no skilled nurses, no comfortable homes for the sick and dying. At one time, all the members of that little band, except 7, were ill. How sad were those days, as these few who were well went from one friend to another, trying to nurse them back to health. Before spring had come, 51 of their number had died. Those who were left with greater energy and toil must now work for the building up of the little colony. With sad but brave hearts, they worked on, building their log huts. At times, these little homes, when half built, would be nearly buried in the deep snow drifts. At other times, when the men would start forth to hunt or to fish, they found the snow too deep for hunting or the ice too thick for fishing. As the days began to lengthen and the weather became warmer, many of the rough little log huts were finished and ready for the loved ones. A great platform had been built, and upon this there had been mounted 5 cannons which the Pilgrims had brought with them on the Mayflower. When the little log house was finished, which William Brewster had built for his family, Priscilla Mullins said, "Dost thou long for thy beautiful old manor house at Scrooby, Mistress Brewster? This little hut, methinks, is much unlike that fine place with its inner and outer court." Mistress Brewster smiled at the young girl and said, "We shall make the best of this, Priscilla, and a day may come when here on this coast there will be many homes as fine as the ones in England. We have but to be patient and brave, dear girl." Priscilla smiled back into the good woman's face as she said, I've heard that the famous place in Scrooby was builded within a moat, and a long flight of stone steps led up to the house. This one block of wood that leads to this little log hut will not weary one in the climbing of it, I am thinking. And with a merry laugh at the little Brewster boys, Priscilla turned and, jumping down the step, was away. I fear Priscilla is too light and gleeful, and we must have our girls more sober-minded, said Elder Brewster, who was the minister of the little colony. In many cases, several families had to live under one roof, and often in one large room, except the children, who climbed a little ladder that led to a loft at the top of the house where they slept. There were no stoves, no furnaces in those early days, and the house was warmed by a great fireplace. It was little comfort, too, at times, that these fireplaces gave, for if one sat in the front of them, his face would almost blister with the heat, and if one sat back in the room, he was soon shivering with the cold. But the fireplaces were all that the little children could have for warming their stinging fingers and cold feet. Many a time the boys would crowd about one of those great fireplaces that extended across one side of their homes, and they would tell stories of some wild Indian that had been seen that day, or some wild animal in the dense, dark forest that had been killed. Here in the fireplace, the great back log would crackle from morning until night. During the day, the great kettle hung from a stout stick that was over the fire. In the kettle, the Pilgrim mothers cooked their food. At night, the fire was covered with ashes in order to keep it until morning. In those days, there were no matches, and if the fire went out, one of the boys was often sent out to a neighbor's house for some coals. On the floors was scattered clean, hard, dry sand, and for the windows, the Pilgrims used wax paper or linen. The boys helped to make some of the furniture for their log huts. Soon, many a boy learned how to make a table, a little stool, or a chair. To be sure, they did not look much like the furniture that we would buy today at our stores, but we must remember they had no stores then, and the boys did their best. No boy can do better than his best, and those mothers were very glad for the tables and chairs that these good, noble boys had made. By springtime, when the birds were all back and the days brought sunshine and warmth, there were 7 houses finished, and 26 acres of land had been cleared. Never was a spring more welcome. After the houses were built, the Pilgrims built a high fence or stockade around their little village. This was to keep the wild beasts away and to better protect themselves from the savage tribes of Indians. Bears, wolves, and many other wild animals lived in the woods, and the children never wandered alone much farther than the little brook that flowed not far distant from the houses. Back of the log huts, the forest trees stretched for miles. The only people who lived in that forest were Indians, and nobody knew how long the Indians had lived there. The Indians lived in wigwams. These wigwams were a kind of tent made of long poles and covered with bark, boughs, or skin. The Indians could easily take down these wigwams and move about from one place to another. During the bleak, cold days of the winter, the Indians lived in some quiet, protected spot in the deep forest. When the warm days of spring came, they took down their wigwams and moved to open fields where they could plant their corn. As the summer days ended, they went to some good hunting ground. As the Pilgrims took their tramps farther and farther into the country, many times they found deserted wigwams or cornfields going to waste, for there was no one to gather their harvest. Again, they found little mounds of graves where Indians had been buried for their bows and spears alongside them. The Pilgrims could not understand this at first, but after a time they decided that there must have been a great sickness among the Indians, and many of them had died. Once the Indians, painted gay and with feathers, came very near their little village, but suddenly turned and ran away. Had they gone to get more Indians to come and attack us? Said the anxious mothers. "We will protect you and the children. Do not fear," said their brave captain, Miles Standish. "Our muskets are always ready, you know, and the Indians have no muskets. They very much fear our firearms." Weeks passed and no more Indians were seen. One forenoon in March, the men were holding a sort of town meeting in the common house, when suddenly there appeared at the door a tall, straight, copper-colored Indian. He was dressed in very little else than his finest feathers and his most gorgeous paint. His painted face glistened in the sunlight. In his hand was a bow nearly as tall as he, and a tomahawk was in his girdle. Like all the other Indians, he wore his coarse, straight, black hair, cut square across his forehead in the front. His hair at the back of his head hung down long, and 3 eagle feathers stuck out from it. One of the pilgrims who was speaking at the time the Indian appeared stopped short in his address. He looked at the strange sight. Some of the other men quickly put up their hands on their muskets to be ready to defend themselves. The Indian looked about him for a moment in silence, and then, with a grunt of approval, he said, "Welcome, welcome, Englishmen," he said. How relieved those men felt to hear such words as these, and they wondered where he could have learned to speak English. The men did not have to wait long to discuss that matter then, but they at once said, "Welcome, welcome, Indian."
Then the Indian, whose name was Samoset, gave another grunt of entire satisfaction and decided to stay a while with his new friends. Samoset told them in his broken English that he had learned a few words from some fishermen who had come to the coast several years before. Then he told them of the plague that had swept all across the area, and a great number of Indians died and were no longer available. And so they felt less powerful than they had been before. For this reason, they had thought best not to molest those Puritans. Although the Indians had gathered and held a wild powwow when they first learned that the Pilgrims were on the coast. Samoset told them of Maserite, their great and powerful leader, who lived many miles away from the forest. All this was very interesting to the Pilgrims, who were much surprised to have such a guest among them. The Pilgrims well knew that they must not in any way displease this visitor, but that they must do all that they could for his pleasure and comfort. John Alden brought him something to drink. Another of the men made him a present of some beads, which he thought was very gorgeous. Governor Carver gave to Samoset a cloak, which he threw over his shoulders with a great deal of satisfaction. As night came on, he had evidently decided to stay. He walked around the little village. At one house, he was given a biscuit. At another, he ate a piece of duck. At a third, he had some cheese. And at another, he was made happy by a plate of pudding. Surely this was a very good place for an Indian like him. He seemed to be well satisfied with all that he saw. So Samoset stayed all night. You may be sure that the Pilgrims did not sleep much that night. They kept a close watch over Samoset, for they said, "Who knows but what his tribe will steal upon us this very night and kill us all?" But the night passed quietly, and all were safe. In the morning, the mothers cooked for him the best breakfast they knew how to cook. And after the men had given him a knife, a bracelet, and a ring, Samoset left them. He seemed to be quite pleased with all that he had seen. The men, women, and children were happy when he had left, and they hoped he would not come back again. What do you think did happen? Just 2 days later, Samoset was back again, and he had 5 Indians with him this time. The 5 Indian warriors were dressed in deerskin robes, bright leggings, and moccasins. They were adorned with their gayest paint, their longest feathers, and their best strings of beads. Of course, these 5 warriors must have fine things to eat and drink, and they must have some fine presents too. After they had eaten and had been kindly received, they formed a circle and danced a weird festival dance. They made wild sounds and wild gestures, and when it was all over, they offered their deerskins to the pilgrims. The pilgrims set Samoset for Masorite. They saw that they could not politely ask the Indians to leave. They knew that if Samoset went for Masorite, he would be away from them for some time, at least, and this seemed the best way and best plan to carry out, and still be polite to the Indians. The great chief at length came. He was a taller, stronger, and braver Indian than any they had seen. Never before had they seen such feathers and such gay paint. Masorite was given a copper chain with a jewel in it, and he received all the attention that the pilgrims could give. He looked at their homes, at the women, at the cannons, and he even looked at the babies. He called the babies no brave and pale-faced papooses. After this, he went to the governor's house, and on a green rug and some cushions, he smoked the pipe of peace with the governor and promised not to harm the pilgrims as long as he should live. In the autumn of 1622, the pilgrims said, "God has led us safely and provided for us. He has given to us blessings and peace and plenty. Let us appoint a day for thanks. It shall be a Thanksgiving day." So a day of thanksgiving and fasting was appointed. Everyone resolved to do his best to make sure this time of merriment and happiness would be fun for all. "Just think of it," cried Mary Allerton, 2 or 3 days of mayhem, of fasting and feasting and games and merrymaking. And she put her arms around her sister, Remember, and whirled about her in the little room. It was hard for these young boys and girls to be sober and sedate and demure at all times, although the older people at that time would much prefer them to be very strict and straight. So the idea of a day when they might play and laugh to their heart's content was very welcome to these little children. Even the little children seemed to understand that they were to have a better time than usual and more things to eat. One of them hopped up and down in glee. Men were sent to the woods to hunt for choice game and to bring home wild turkey and deer in great quantity. Other men went out fishing. The children went down to the shore to dig for clams. The mothers baked and cooked all the good things they could think of: bread, pies, cakes, and puddings. Love Brewster, Wrestling Brewster, the Allerton children, with Desire Minter, and some of the men went to gather golden pumpkins, wild grapes, and plums. King Masorite and some of his braves had been invited, and they all came. On the day appointed at sunrise, the people at the little village were startled by terrific war whoops and Indian shrieks. At once they knew the Indians they invited had arrived. The Indians received a truly royal welcome from Miles Standish, who was up early to fire the sunrise gun. Masorite and his 90 brave soldiers were there in all the gayest paint, robes and feathers they had. How the children did stare at them. As soon as the children heard the noise of the Indians, they were up and dressed, and like Masorite, ready for all the good things that the great day had promised. After breakfast, the roll of the drums called the pilgrims to church. After church, great outdoor fires were started for cooking. Back and forth, the young girls ran from the fires to the tables that had been set. Long rows of wooden bowls were soon filled with steaming hot clam chowder. Then there was biscuits and vegetables and oysters and fish, all cooked in the most appetizing manner. After this came the roast turkey and the deer meat. Then among other good things, Priscilla had made a famous salad, and the edge of the dish was all garnished with bright autumn leaves. Great baskets of grapes and plums followed, the pies and puddings, and it is not strange that the Indians never enjoyed a dinner so much as this in all their lives. It certainly was It certainly was a grand feast. The Indians evidently thought so also, for they ate all these things with the greatest relish and satisfaction. After the table was cleared, the Indians brought forth a bag, and it was a bushel of popped corn. This they poured out on the tables. Never before had the children eaten this. How beautiful the snowy white mass looked to them. After the feasting was over, the Indians engaged in shooting matches with their bows and arrows. Then there was some military exercises with Captain Miles Standish, who had planned for this occasion. The Indians were asked to sit down on the ground in a circle. With a blare of trumpet, a row of drums, and a weaving of banners, the little military company proudly marched down the hill. The Indians were at first much interested, but they became very terrified at the intervals. Captain Standish gave the order for the company to fire their muskets. Once when the time came and the cannon from the top of the hill roared out, suddenly it struck terror to their very souls. Ha ha, laughed Mary Chilton. Our captain likes a good joke now as well as he did in the days when he served the Queen in a foreign service. In conclusion, it says, the Indians formed a hunting party and brought home 5 deer to the colonists. The feast lasted 3 days, and when the great chief left, he said, God loves his white children best. That was by Ella, what was her name? No, anyway, it doesn't matter. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that. Reading was difficult for listening, for people to listen, but I think everybody did a good job. And so, let's have a word of prayer. Our Father, we thank you for this opportunity. We come and remember the bravery and courage of our forefathers, those who faced just hollering experiences crossing that ocean in a tiny little ship, not knowing what they would face on the other shore, not knowing what they would encounter, not knowing what hardships, although they knew there'd be many. But nevertheless, bravely they conquered each and every one. And may it be an inspiration for us that we will conquer the hardships we face in our lives also. We ask it for your courage to be upon each and every one of us.